In my BookTube newbie tag, I talked about how much I love historical fiction. So today's video is my top 25 historical fiction books, which was quite hard to narrow down to only 25. So perhaps I'll do a part 2 at a later point. My first book, in no particular order, is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. I am a huge Kingsolver fan, and I think this was one of the first books of hers I read. It is this incredible story of a family, a missionary family who travel to the Congo, and it's about their arrogance at assuming that the people of the Congo want to be saved by them. And it really taught me so much about the damage of colonization, particularly in a religious context. It was really heartbreaking, really moving, and one of those books that just makes you so angry at one of the characters, which I think for a book to make you feel such strong emotions, you know it's got to be an incredible story. Number 2, I mentioned this book before, but it's one of my favourite books called The Far Pavilions by MMK. It is set during the British colonisation in India and follows the adventures and stories of the main character called Ash. There are all sorts of fascinating and heartbreaking things that happen in this book, but the main things that I learnt were about the Second Afghan Civil War. I learned a lot about the Indian Mutiny, also called the First War of Independence, that happened when Indian soldiers mutinied against the British. I also learned a lot about some Indian cultural traditions in the past, such as suttees, which is where brides, often quite young brides, were expected to immolate themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands. And actually I went to India and I saw some of the handprints of some of those suttees later. So that book really kind of affected me and meant a lot to me. And one of the main places that I visited in the book was the Hawa Mahal in Jaipur. So I was really excited to see a palace that I'd also read about in one of my favourite books. Book 3, this is more of a young adult recommendation for historical fiction, is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. One of the really interesting things about this story is that the narrator is death. So it's from the point of view of death and is set in World War II. And particularly references the burning of books by the Nazis and follows a young girl as she encounters the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. Book 4 is another very emotional read by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called Half of a Yellow Sun. From this book, I learned so much about Nigeria, about what became known as the Civil War in Nigeria and one of the worst human atrocities that happened when the world watched as people in Biafra, a section of Nigeria, were starving. And I just had no idea about this. I'd never even heard of it before reading this book. And it really is a powerful, quite traumatic read, as you can imagine, but a book that I think is important and that people should read, although it does come with several trigger warnings. My next book is set during World War II, and it is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. It has been made recently into a Netflix show, so some people may have seen that. I learned a lot from this book, not necessarily new information about World War II, because I feel we learn a lot about Europe and World War II when I was at school. But I learned a lot about the sympathies that existed, that the struggles that were there. One of the characters is a German soldier, and I found that storyline really interesting. My book number 6 is The Glass Palace by Amitav Ghosh. Now, I couldn't decide between this one and Sea of Poppies, but I decided to go for The Glass Palace because it spans a wider range of countries. So it covers India, Malaya, and Burma at that time. And I just learned a lot about the world in Asia, how people moved between the different continents, the importance of timber during that time. There are references to the opium trade, and I definitely recommend it for learning more about sections of Asia, particularly what happened under colonization in some of those countries. Number 7 is The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. This is one of probably the most famous books to come out of the US. And I think for me, it was one of the first books I read that had very spicy lesbian feelings in it. And I think that was just really powerful and has an effect on me about feeling liberated. And I feel like you're really on the side of the character who has been abused and downtrodden. And I learned a lot from that book about the treatment of Black people in the US at the time, particularly poor people, and the abuse and oppression that happened. The book number 8 on my list is Saigon by Anthony Gray. Now, this is a huge fat book and I really enjoyed it. It's one of my favourites, a multi-generational read, which is set in different areas of Vietnam, despite being called Saigon. And I think I learned a lot about the French colonization of Vietnam and subsequently the Vietnamese War that happened when the US invaded and sent troops to support the French that were there, which is also a civil war between the North and the South in Vietnam. And I think the book does a really good job of explaining through fictional characters how that came about. And I felt much more knowledgeable about Vietnam and the history after reading this book, which should not be that surprising because Anthony Gray is actually a journalist first and foremost rather than a novelist. So while it did read like a novel and does have fictional characters, it also has true characters such as Ho Chi Minh himself, who appears as a character in the story. Number 9, I think, is even a bigger book than Saigon. It's called The Eighth Life by Nino Haratishvili. And I actually love this book so much I named one of my foster cats Nino after this author. This book taught me so much about the country of Georgia. Stalin is a character in this book. Again, like most of my favorites, it's this entwined multi-generational story that starts with grandparents and goes down the generations of all of the things that have happened in Georgia, connections with Russia, communism, really, really fascinating parts of history, and I really recommend it, although make sure you leave yourself time to read this book because it is really big. My 10th book is The Mercies by Kieran Millward Hargrave. This book kind of broke me. It is set in the 1400s in Norway, and right at the beginning of the book, a freak wave, kind of a tsunami, wipes out all the fishermen in this small remote village, which you'd think would be a good thing. So there are only women left. However, there is then a witch hunt and witch trials that happens because the men, particularly Christian figures, one of whom is a real historical figure in this book, cannot stand the idea that women are running this area. And it is just a heartbreaking book and one of those books that really makes you feel injustice. So a bit of a trigger warning there, but I really think it's a book that everybody should read, and it will probably make you really angry like me. Number 11 is The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. Now, I think this should go in two categories because it centres a lot around the ocean, one of my favourite topics to talk about, and also is historical fiction. It is set in the island of Jeju in South Korea and tells the story of female divers who free dive down to collect sea cucumbers and sea urchins to feed their families. And it is all about what happens when the Japanese invade. It talks a lot about sympathizers, about resistance to the colonizers, and I definitely recommend for the history and also for this kind of powerful story of female friendship and female support. Number 12 is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. Now, this goes into the realm of magical realism, so there are some elements of the story that are magical, and it's all set in the backdrop of Chile and what happened when there was a military coup. And again, it follows the story of one family. Isabel Allende's own family were actually affected by military coups and lived in exile. So I think that made it even more powerful knowing that. I think this has to be up there as one of my favourite books. Again, there are some very dark and heavy sections of this book, as you would expect, with the brutality of the army taking over and putting down any resistance to their rule. But I definitely still recommend it. Number 13 is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, I do think this one's a little bit niche because I am British, and this is set during the time of the Tudors when they were on the throne, particularly Henry VIII. It tells the story of a historical character, a real character called Thomas Cromwell, who was one of the advisors to Henry VIII. And it's actually a first part in a series that talks about his rise to power. And one of the things that I learned from this book, and I was surprised to find out, was that this advisor to the King of England was actually a quite lowly person with no rank, and so that disgruntled a lot of the aristocracy at the time. And I was quite surprised that someone from such a background could manage to rise to the ranks to actually become one of the king's top advisors that would be listened to. So I think lots of us, even if you're not British, are fascinated by Henry VIII and the 6 wives that he had. So this talks about his first 3 wives during this book. By Henry VIII and the tales of his 6 wives. So if you're interested in information about that, then I definitely recommend this because there was lots of learning. The other thing to note about this book is that it's quite difficult to tell when people are talking and when people are thinking, which is quite unique, perhaps, kind of writing. But if you've read it, let me know what you thought about it. My next book, number 14, is The Gift of Rain by Tan Tuan Eng. Now, this book is all set in Penang in Malaysia. It is set during World War II and follows the story of an Anglo-Malayan family who live in Penang, and the son in the family befriends a Japanese man. Again, it's one of those stories where people are meant to be enemies because of what is happening politically at the time during World War II and just the run up to World War II. And I really learned so much about Southeast Asia during that time. And I've also visited Penang a couple of times, so I found it really interesting for them to reference places in the story, such as the fort that you can go and visit when you're in Penang. My book number 15 is Mosquito by Roma Tern. This story is incredible. It's essentially a doomed love story between 2 people set against the civil war in Sri Lanka. Now, a bit like India, I'm really obsessed with reading books about Sri Lanka. I visited Sri Lanka several times, and I think this book does a really good job of explaining what's happening during the Civil War, of educating people about the senselessness of what happened during the Sri Lankan Civil War, which went on for the minimum of 25 years. And I definitely recommend this book for people interested in Sri Lanka. Number 16 is Small Island by Andrea Levy. This book I found fascinating because it was a whole section of history I didn't really know much about, and I feel like I should know things about it because it involves British colonisation of Jamaica, when Jamaicans were invited to England to work, to try and boost the workforce in England, and were met with discrimination and outright racism. They found it very difficult to rent places because people didn't want to rent to Black people. And I just learned so much from this book. I think it's a fantastic story as well. And there's a huge twist at the end, which I definitely didn't see coming. So I definitely recommend Small Island. It's also been made into a theatre play, so I'd love to hear from you if you've seen the play. Number 17 is another book that kind of broke my heart, which is A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. It is all set in India. It follows the story of 4 friends from being young adults all the way through to adulthood, later adulthood, and it is just really heartbreaking. It's really interesting about the last kind of, I'd say, 50 years in India, of Indian history. A lot of political turmoil that's happening, and how those friendships interweave, how they change, how they shift as a result of what is happening in India at the time. So I definitely recommend it. I really recommend it if you need to cry, because it's definitely a tearjerker of a book. My number 18 is also a book about India. It is A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. This book, I think, does a really good job of capturing traditions, different families, different religions in India. It follows a range of different characters and who kind of all interlink during their lives in the book, and I think just does this incredible job of capturing India, making you want to visit India, teaching you about different cultures and traditions that are there. And I definitely recommend it for anyone who loves books about India or loves visiting India. Number 19, I've gone off a little bit with this one, but it is Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Now, I wanted to try and get in a range of books from different time periods, and this one is set in 18th century England. And I wasn't sure what to expect when I first picked up this book. But honestly, I think I just love any books that are about women behaving badly. And that is definitely Moll Flanders. And you just see this incredible story of coming through crime and punishment, and all about the treatment of women at the time, particularly women who are from poorer backgrounds. And I just really recommend it. I think it explains a lot about Britain at the time, about people's attitudes towards women then too. Number 20 is The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. I feel like you can't go wrong with any of Khaled Hosseini's books, and I'm definitely going to do a playlist on a lot of his books, including And the Mountains Echoed and A Thousand Splendid Suns. So subscribe if you're interested in more recommendations for books by Khaled Hosseini. This was the first Khaled Hosseini book that I read. It was actually a recommendation from my English teacher when I was at school. She gave us each a little note with a book recommendation that was personalised for us, and she was absolutely not wrong. I adored this book. It is very heartbreaking. It is all set in Afghanistan. There's an event that happens, and everything after that event is connected with guilt and redemption and how we treat each other, and it's just really powerful, and I definitely recommend it. Now, book 21 is a little bit lighter hearted because there's been a lot of quite heavy books on my historical fiction list so far. So I have gone for an Elif Shafak book called The 40 Rules of Love. Now, I didn't know what to expect with this book because I love Elif Shafak, but I think this book reads quite differently from some of her others. So there are two storylines that happen in this book. One of them is a modern day woman who is in an unhappy marriage. She's married with children and searching for something. And it's interspersed with information about the poet Rumi, set in the 12th century in what is now modern day Turkey. And if you've not heard of Rumi, you might have seen some of his poems. They're all over places like Pinterest. And he writes so beautifully. I think it gives a really interesting perspective of Islam at the time, which is quite different to some of our perceptions of Islam today. And so I really recommend people reading it who have an interest in Islam, are interested in Turkey, perhaps have heard of the poet Rumi, love poetry. I definitely recommend reading this book. And again, it's a little bit lighter hearted than some of the others on my list. Number 22 is Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernières. This book I read a long time ago, I think when I was a teenager, and it's set on one of the Greek islands. And I think it was one of the first books where I saw soldiers coming back from war and realizing the brutality of war and how that affects people and how that really changes people. And I think this book does a really good job of capturing that. And it's just tragic. And I learned a lot as well about World War II and the Greek islands, but also events that happened in Albania. So it's really interesting if you're interested in European history. My book number 23 is Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. I love Kate Atkinson. She writes a lot of books based in Cambridge, which is actually my hometown. This book is based in London, but it's really clever because it's called Life After Life, and it's about all the different storylines that could have happened to one character based on different situations, different decisions that she made. And I love a storyline like that. So it's really interesting. A lot of it covers across World War I and World War II in England. There are sections about the Blitz in London, which I really have a vivid memory of from reading this book. So I definitely recommend it if you're interested in World War historical fiction. Book number 24 is Alone in Berlin by Hans Verlade. I thought this book was absolutely fascinating. It's based on a couple who decided to resist the Nazis and Hitler's rule by posting postcards all around Berlin. And this is a tale of this couple, their bravery, their resistance in the face of what was happening at the time. Absolutely terrifying scenes and what might happen to them if they were caught. It's really tense in sections as well, so it's quite thrilling, but also teaches you a lot about Berlin during World War II. And my last book is 25, which is The Last Train to Istanbul by Ays Kulin. This is, again, it's a World War II historical fiction book, and it's basically about Jews trying to escape from Europe to safety, to get away from the persecution of the Nazis. And they put on this train to Istanbul, which has offered to provide protection for Jews if they manage to arrive there. And they charter this train into the heart of Germany during Hitler's peak there. And I think it's a fantastic book. It covers a lot of different areas of Europe, and it really happened. And I think, I definitely recommend this book. So that was 25 of my favourite historical fiction reads. I'd love to hear some of yours, see if you agree or disagree with any of mine, and let me know if you have any recommendations that you think I'd like based on what I've shared today.